In 1945, in the final weeks of the Second World War, something extraordinary was happening across the collapsing remnants of Nazi Germany. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, many of them battle-hardened veterans who had fought for years on the Eastern Front, were doing something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They were running, not from battle but toward it. Or more precisely, they were running away from one enemy and desperately trying to reach another. They were fleeing the Soviet Red Army and attempting to surrender to the Americans. This wasn't about ideology or loyalty to the crumbling Third Reich. This was about survival, and the choices these men faced would determine whether they lived or died, whether they saw their families again or disappeared into the frozen wastes of Siberia. By April 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its inevitable conclusion. The Third Reich that Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years was now measured in days. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, smashing through the final defensive lines with overwhelming force. American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive military juggernauts, and every German soldier knew that the end was near. But for the men of the Wehrmacht, the war's conclusion presented a terrifying dilemma. Surrender was now inevitable, but to whom they surrendered would make all the difference in the world. The men of the German armed forces understood with crystal clarity what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands. They had seen what their own army had done during the invasion of the Soviet Union. They had witnessed and in many cases participated in a war of annihilation that had left millions of Soviet civilians dead and Soviet prisoners of war starved in open-air camps. The German military had violated every convention of warfare on the Eastern Front. They had implemented Hitler's infamous Commissar Order, which called for the summary execution of Soviet political officers. They had stood by while SS Einsatzgruppen murdered Jews and other civilians by the hundreds of thousands. They had watched as more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died from starvation, exposure, and disease in German custody between 1941 and 1942. The mortality rate of Soviet prisoners in German hands had reached nearly 60%, one of the highest sustained death rates of any mass atrocity in history. Now the bill was coming due. The Soviet forces advancing into Germany in 1945 were not coming as liberators. They were coming for revenge. The Red Army had suffered unimaginable losses fighting its way back from the gates of Moscow to the heart of Berlin. More than 8 million Soviet soldiers had died. Countless millions of Soviet civilians had been killed, starved, or worked to death. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Villages had been burned to the ground. The Soviet Union had been devastated in ways that no other Allied nation had experienced, and the men of the Red Army had not forgotten. The evidence was everywhere. As Soviet forces entered East Prussia in October 1944, reports began filtering back to German units about what was happening to civilians who fell into Soviet hands. The massacre at Nemmersdorf became one of the first and most notorious incidents. When German forces briefly retook the village, they found scenes of horror. Women had been raped and murdered. Civilians had been nailed to barn doors and shot. The dead included not just Germans, but also French and Belgian prisoners of war who had been working on nearby farms. Whether these reports were exaggerated by Nazi propaganda or not, the underlying truth was undeniable. The Red Army was extracting terrible vengeance on German soil. Soviet soldiers were engaging in widespread looting, rape, and killing as they swept across East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. Some estimates suggest that as many as 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during the final year of the war. The city of Berlin alone saw more than 100,000 rape cases according to hospital reports in the spring of 1945. These were not isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern that Soviet commanders did little to stop. When Yugoslav partisan leader Milovan Djilas complained to Stalin about similar conduct by Soviet troops in Yugoslavia, Stalin reportedly replied that soldiers who had crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire deserved to have some fun. The message was clear. The Red Army's conduct in Germany was not just tolerated, but in some ways encouraged as just retribution for German crimes in the Soviet Union. German soldiers on the Eastern Front understood what this meant for them. Surrender to the Soviets meant captivity in conditions that many would not survive. Those who were taken prisoner faced brutal treatment, forced labor in harsh conditions, and years of imprisonment in camps across the vast Soviet Union. Of the roughly 3 million German soldiers taken prisoner by the Soviets during the war, more than 1 million would die in captivity. Even those who survived would not see home for years. Many German prisoners were not released until the early 1950s, and the last prisoners held by the Soviets were not returned to Germany until 1956, more than a decade after the war's end. The mortality rate for German prisoners in Soviet hands was approximately 36%, a staggering figure that reflected both the harshness of Soviet captivity and the Soviet desire for revenge. In contrast, surrender to the Americans or British offered something entirely different. The Western Allies, despite their fury at Nazi atrocities and the horrors they had discovered in the concentration camps, still largely adhered to the Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. Of the roughly 231,000 British and American prisoners held by the Germans during the war, about 3.6% had died in German custody. The Germans had generally respected international law when dealing with Western prisoners, viewing the British and Americans as racial equals. Now, in the war's final weeks, German soldiers desperately hoped that the Western Allies would show them the same consideration. And for the most part, they were right. Of the millions of German prisoners taken by American and British forces, the mortality rate was roughly 1%, similar to that experienced by Western prisoners in German hands. Prisoners of the Western Allies could expect to be fed, housed in proper camps, and treated according to international law. Most importantly, they could expect to go home within a few years rather than disappearing into the Soviet Gulag system for a decade or more. This stark difference in treatment was not lost on German soldiers and commanders as the war reached its climax. Throughout April and early May 1945, entire German units began making desperate attempts to fight their way west, to break through Soviet encirclements and reach American lines before it was too late. One of the most dramatic examples of this phenomenon was the Battle of Halbe, fought in the forests south of Berlin during the final week of April 1945. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Busse, found itself encircled in a pocket in the Spree forest region southeast of Berlin. The army had been battered in the Battle of the Seelow Heights, and was now trapped between Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front attacking from the northeast and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian front pressing from the south. The Ninth Army numbered approximately 80,000 men at the start of the encirclement, but they had fewer than 80 tanks and perhaps 200 armoured vehicles. They were short on ammunition, fuel and supplies. Soviet forces surrounding them numbered in the hundreds of thousands and were supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. Hitler, still directing operations from his bunker beneath Berlin, ordered Busse to turn north and fight his way to Berlin to help defend the capital. But Busse had no intention of obeying this suicidal order. Instead, he coordinated with General Walter Wenck, commander of the 12th Army to the west. Together, they hatched a plan that had nothing to do with defending Berlin or preserving the Third Reich. Their goal was to open a corridor through which soldiers of the Ninth Army could escape westward and surrender to American forces waiting on the far side of the Elbe River. On the night of April 24, 1945, the Ninth Army began its breakout attempt. The focal point was the small village of Halbe, which would give its name to the battle. German forces had to fight their way through multiple lines of Soviet troops, pushing west through the pine forests while under constant artillery bombardment and air attack. The fighting was savage and desperate. Soviet commanders, recognizing what the Germans were attempting, poured in reinforcements and unleashed devastating firepower on the German columns. Katyusha rockets screamed through the air, exploding in the treetops and sending deadly splinters of wood and metal raining down on German troops below. The chaos was indescribable. Military units mixed with civilian refugees who'd been fleeing westward ahead of the Soviet advance. Wounded soldiers tried to keep up with the columns as Soviet tanks and infantry attacked from multiple directions. German rearguards fought desperately to hold open escape routes, while the main body pushed west. Communications broke down. Command structures collapsed. Individual units found themselves fighting independently, trying to find gaps in the Soviet lines through which they could slip. For a week this nightmare continued. On April 28, German forces managed to break through the Soviet 50th Guards Rifle Division and create a corridor from Halbe toward the west, but they paid a terrible price. Thousands of German soldiers were killed in the fighting. Soviet forces attacked the flanks of the corridor, trying to cut it off and trap the Germans once again. By late April, the situation had become even more desperate. The rearguard of the 9th Army was still near Storkow, fighting off Soviet attacks, while the vanguard had managed to link up with elements of Wenck's 12th Army near Belitz. But large groups of German soldiers and civilians remained scattered throughout the pocket under constant bombardment and attack. The Soviet battle plan was straightforward. They would split the German forces into smaller segments and then destroy each segment individually. The German plan was equally simple. Keep moving west at all costs, keep the corridor open, get as many men as possible to the Elbe River and American lines beyond. General Wenck and his 12th Army played a crucial role in this desperate drama. Wenck had been ordered by Hitler to turn his army east from the Elbe and march on Berlin to relieve the capital. But Wenck, like Busse, understood that this was impossible. His army was newly formed, made up of a hodgepodge of units scraped together in the war's final weeks. Many of his soldiers were little more than boys, teenagers from the Hitler Youth who had barely finished school. They had only a handful of tanks and armoured vehicles, little fuel and limited ammunition. The idea that such a force could fight its way through overwhelming Soviet numbers to rescue Berlin was fantasy. But Wenck could do something else. He could attack toward Potsdam and the forests south of Berlin, drawing Soviet forces away and creating opportunities for men of the 9th Army to escape. He could open gaps in the Soviet lines through which refugees and soldiers could flee west toward the Elbe. Wenck called this his Rettungswerk, his rescue mission. He told his officers that it was not about Berlin anymore. It was not about the Reich anymore. It was about saving as many lives as possible. On April 26, the 12th Army launched its attack. Units including the infantry division. Hutten, made up of hardened veterans, drove northeast toward Potsdam. They fought with ferocity born of desperation, knowing that thousands of lives depended on their success. They engaged Soviet forces in intense combat, pushing forward and then holding their positions as long as possible to keep escape routes open. The attacks created confusion in the Soviet rear areas and opened temporary gaps in their lines. Through these gaps, columns of German soldiers and refugees streamed westward. Wenck's forces could not hold these positions indefinitely. Soviet counterattacks were relentless, backed by overwhelming artillery and air support. But every hour the Wenck's men held their ground was another hour for the 9th Army to move closer to the Elbe. By late April, the combined forces of the 9th and 12th Armies, along with tens of thousands of civilians, were moving west in a great flood of humanity, all trying to reach the river before Soviet forces could cut them off. The Elbe River represented salvation. American forces had reached the western bank of the river and then stopped. The Americans and Soviets had agreed on occupation zones, and the Elbe roughly marked the boundary. Beyond the Elbe lay safety, the prospect of decent treatment as prisoners of war, and eventual return home. But getting across the river was the final and perhaps most dangerous challenge. By early May, the partially destroyed bridge at Tangermunde had become the primary crossing point. Between May 4th and May 7th, 1945, a desperate stream of German soldiers and civilians crossed this bridge under fire from Soviet forces closing in from the east. They surrendered to elements of the United States' 102nd Infantry Division of the 9th Army. Approximately 25,000 German soldiers made it across, along with several thousand civilians. Behind them, more than 40,000 German soldiers had been killed in the Battle of Halbe and the subsequent fighting. Tens of thousands more had been captured by Soviet forces and faced the grim prospect of years in Soviet labor camps. The story of Halbe was not unique. All across the dissolving Eastern Front, German units were attempting similar escapes. In Czechoslovakia, units of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner's Army Group Center tried to break through to American lines. Some succeeded. Others were intercepted by Soviet or Czech partisan forces and forced to surrender. The Battle of Slivice, fought on May 11th and 12th, 1945, was one of the last such engagements. German forces under SS Gruppenführer Karl Friedrich von Puckler-Berghaus, trying to reach American positions, found themselves blocked by Czech partisans and then attacked by advancing Soviet forces. After fierce fighting that included Soviet artillery bombardment and attacks by multiple Soviet army fronts, the German forces finally surrendered in the early hours of May 12th. About 6,000 German soldiers were captured by Soviet troops rather than reaching the Americans as they had hoped. Their commander, Puckler-Berghaus, committed suicide shortly after the surrender. The desperation of German forces to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets was so widespread that it became a significant factor in Allied planning during the war's final weeks. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who assumed leadership of Germany after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, pursued a deliberate policy of trying to arrange separate surrenders to Western forces while continuing to fight the Soviets. His goal was to allow as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to flee west and avoid Soviet captivity. Dönitz's representative, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, attempted to negotiate partial surrenders with Western commanders, offering to surrender forces facing the Americans and British while keeping forces fighting against the Soviets in place. The Western Allies refused these attempts. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower insisted on simultaneous unconditional surrender on all fronts. On May 6, 1945, Eisenhower delivered an ultimatum through General Alfred Jodl, who had been sent to Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. If Germany did not surrender unconditionally on all fronts, the Western Allies would close their lines to German forces trying to surrender and would resume bombing German cities and positions. Dönitz authorized Jodl to sign the surrender documents, but attempted to negotiate a 48-hour delay in implementation. His hope was that this delay would allow more German forces in the east to flee westward before the surrender took effect. The first instrument of surrender was signed at Reims at 2:41 in the morning on May 7th, 1945. A second signing took place in Berlin on May 8th, with the Soviets insisting on this additional ceremony to emphasize that they were equal partners in Germany's defeat. Even after the official surrender, German units continued trying to reach Western lines. The formal grace period for implementing the surrender was loose, and some German commanders interpreted the orders liberally, continuing to move west and evacuate soldiers and civilians for days after the official surrender date. Not everyone made it. Thousands of German soldiers who tried to surrender to Western forces were turned back and forced to surrender to Soviet troops instead. The Yalta Conference agreement between the Allied powers had established occupation zones, and Allied commanders were under orders to respect these boundaries. German soldiers found themselves in the agonizing position of having fought their way to within sight of American lines, only to be turned away and handed over to Soviet forces. The treatment they received justified their worst fears. Soviet prisoner of war camps were brutal. German prisoners were put to forced labor in mines, factories, and construction projects across the Soviet Union. They worked in conditions that were harsh even by the standards of wartime labor camps. Food was scarce, medical care was minimal, and the climate in many regions where prisoners were sent was severe. Prisoners died from malnutrition, disease, exposure, and accidents. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers taken prisoner by the Soviets, more than 1 million died in captivity. The survivors endured years of imprisonment. Although some prisoners were released in the late 1940s, many remained in Soviet camps through the early 1950s. The last German prisoners were not released until 1956, when West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated their return during a visit to Moscow. These men had been in Soviet captivity for more than a decade, having missed the entire reconstruction of Germany and the return to normal life that other prisoners of war had experienced years earlier. In contrast, German prisoners held by American and British forces fared far better. Although conditions in some camps were difficult, especially in the chaotic final months of the war, when millions of prisoners overwhelmed Allied camp systems, the mortality rate remained low. Most German prisoners held by Western forces were released by the end of 1948. They returned home to a Germany that was beginning to rebuild, to families they had not seen in years, but at least they returned. The stark difference in treatment was not lost on anyone. Historian Niall Ferguson has noted that it is clear many German units sought to surrender to the Americans in preference to other Allied forces, and particularly in preference to the Red Army. This preference was rational and based on accurate assessment of the likely treatment they would receive. German soldiers and officers who made it to American lines frequently expressed relief and gratitude at having avoided Soviet captivity. Those who did not make it faced a fate that many had feared more than death itself. The desperate flight westward in the spring of 1945 represented one of the largest and most dramatic mass movements of military forces at the end of any war. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, knowing the war was lost, focused their remaining strength and resources not on continuing to fight but on escaping to surrender to the right enemy. They abandoned defensive positions facing the Western Allies. They ignored orders from Berlin to defend every inch of German soil. They disobeyed direct commands from Hitler to turn and march to the relief of Berlin. Instead, they fled west, fighting off Soviet attempts to stop them, enduring terrible casualties, but driven by the knowledge that their survival and their futures depended on reaching American or British lines. The American soldiers who received these surrenders found themselves in an unusual position. They were accepting the surrender of enemy forces who were desperate to give up their weapons, desperate to be taken prisoner, desperate to avoid capture by other Allied forces. Some American units found German soldiers literally begging to be allowed to surrender, offering intelligence, offering to work, offering anything if they could just be taken into American custody rather than handed over to the Soviets. The scenes at the Elbe River in early May 1945 were extraordinary. American soldiers watched as endless columns of exhausted, often wounded German soldiers and civilians streamed across the river, willing to brave Soviet artillery fire from behind them for the chance to reach American lines. The Americans did what they could to accept these surrenders and provide basic care for the prisoners and refugees, but the sheer numbers were overwhelming. In April 1945 alone, Western Allied forces took 1.5 million German prisoners. By the end of the war, American and British forces held more than 5 million German prisoners of war. Processing and housing this enormous mass of humanity while the war was still ongoing presented enormous logistical challenges. But for the German soldiers who made it across, these challenges were far preferable to the alternative. The contrast between Eastern and Western prisoner of war experiences became one of the defining features of the war's aftermath. It shaped German memory of the war's end and contributed to the division of Germany into East and West. Those who had been prisoners of the Soviets returned, if they returned at all, with stories of brutal treatment and years of forced labour. Those who had been prisoners of the Americans or British returned much sooner and with far less traumatic experiences. This difference reinforced the developing Cold War divide and contributed to West Germany's firm alignment with the Western powers in the post-war years. The desperate attempts by German forces to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets also highlighted the failure of Nazi propaganda in the war's final weeks. For years, Joseph Goebbels and other Nazi propagandists had worked to convince German soldiers and civilians that the Western Allies were as much their enemies as the Soviets, that there was no difference between American, British and Soviet occupation, that surrender to any Allied power meant death or slavery. But when the moment of decision came, German soldiers voted with their feet. They understood that there was indeed a profound difference, and they acted on that understanding even when it meant fighting against overwhelming odds to reach Western lines. The story of German forces desperately trying to surrender to Americans in 1945 is a story about choices made in the most extreme circumstances. It is about soldiers who had fought for an evil regime recognizing in the war's final days that their only chance for survival lay in surrendering to enemies who would treat them as human beings rather than as objects of revenge. It is about generals who disobeyed orders from their supreme commander in order to save the lives of their men. It is about tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians enduring one more battle, one more forced march, one more artillery barrage, for the chance to cross a river and surrender to forces they knew would not execute them, starve them, or send them to die in labour camps. That so many succeeded is remarkable. That so many failed and fell into Soviet hands is tragic. That the difference between success and failure was so profound, so literally a matter of life or death, makes this one of the most dramatic episodes of the Second World War's final chapter. The men who crossed the Elbe in May 1945 were the lucky ones, and they knew it.